Hi, I'm Jane Muller from GrowCom, Queensland's Fruit and Vegetable Growers Industry Association. This webinar is part of GrowCom's Whatever the Weather program. This is a natural disaster preparedness initiative for Queensland's horticulture industry. Our initiative is supported by funds from the Australian Government's business program under their Department of Industry and Science. In this webinar series, we're looking at a framework that growers can apply in their business to help move to a more proactive approach to managing the risks of severe weather events and natural disasters. It's a simple framework that helps growers think through the things they can do on the farm and in their business to prevent impacts from natural disasters, or at least hopefully reduce them, to prepare for severe weather events, to be able to respond effectively if something occurs, and to be in the best possible position to recover from damaging weather events. The framework is commonly called the Prevent, Prepare, Respond, Recover framework, and it's used by emergency agencies around Australia and in fact around the world, and we think it's just as useful to be used in the fruit and vegetable industry. In previous webinars we've looked at what you can do to be as disaster ready as you possibly can be. In this webinar we're going to talk about what's involved in recovering from a natural disaster. For farming families, natural disasters can be particularly horrible because they impact on people's home, their farm, the business, and of course their local community. And a lot of growers experience quite long-term impacts from disasters as they affect their markets, their productivity, their profitability, and sometimes their mental health. People who've been involved as industry recovery officers or farm financial counsellors or other sorts of people who are supporting growers in the natural disaster recovery process have talked about natural disaster recovery as being a bit like running a marathon. They've said that people who really sort of start out at a sprint really do run the risk of burning out completely and maybe not being able to get to where they need to be at the end of the process. So in this webinar we're going to run through some of the steps that you might need to be aware of that are useful to know about if you ever needed to rebuild your farm business after a severe weather event or a significant natural disaster. To successfully rebuild your farm business after a natural disaster event requires, as I mentioned, quite a lot of time in some cases. It certainly needs a fair bit of thinking and a fair bit of planning. You need to be open to the idea that there's a lot of things that you can do for yourself, but there could very well be times and things that you need to get some extra assistance or support from beyond your business and from beyond your family team. And you're certainly going to need plenty of patience. So as far as you possibly can, give yourself plenty of time to think through how you're going to approach your recovery tasks, and give yourself the opportunity to use this as a chance to implement some of the improvements that you might have been thinking about for some time. If you're in a rebuild phase, it might be an opportunity to sort of do the sort of build back better idea. It's quite common for growers who've experienced a major natural disaster or a really severe weather event that's caused a lot of damage to experience the problem of just not being able to think clearly, not being able to organise their thoughts, not being able to really come up with clear decisions after the event. And I suppose the point that we wanted to make here was that if that's the experience that you're having, I guess not to feel bad about it, because it really is quite a common issue that a lot of people do face. These are the times when it's important that you kind of reach out and get some support or some help from someone who's from outside and who hasn't gone through the experience that you have. And this is where the industry recovery officers that are often located within industry organisations can be really invaluable, because they're the kind of people that can just sit down with you and just help you think through what needs to be thought through and what decisions need to be made. So we've talked about a lot of issues around the cleanup of your property after a big disaster event in some of our previous webinars. And in one of our previous webinars I actually made the point, and I should make it again, that sometimes it's important not to rush into the cleanup. So before you really get cracking on it, it's a really good idea to get good records of what's happened on your property as a result of this disaster. That means taking lots and lots of photos, keeping notes, video footage if that seems like a good idea. And always check with your insurer before you get too stuck into the cleanup, because you need to know what the assessor might need to see when they come. Use the cleanup process to begin to scope the kind of tasks that you're going to want to include in your recovery plan. This might be a time when you want to think laterally about the resources that you do have available and what alternate uses you could put them to. And most people find that when they've got pretty severe damage on their property, they certainly need as much help as is available from family, from friends, from staff. And there's often a lot of volunteers around after a natural disaster event, and they can often be really, really valuable and helpful as well. A lot of growers have actually found that their staff who are able to get to the property are quite willing to volunteer their time to help with the cleanup. If you've got a good relationship with your staff, growers have often felt quite pleased that their staff have offered to volunteer their help. In terms of the sort of broader pool of volunteers who might be able to help on your property, regional councils often play a really important role coordinating work crews and work teams. So it's definitely worth getting in touch with the council about that. There's also a couple of websites that help to coordinate volunteers as well. So there's Volunteer in Queensland, and there's also the conservation volunteers. If some of the stuff that you need to sort out is along creek lines or riverbanks, sometimes the conservation groups get some really helpful work crews to help with those jobs as well. So communication issues during the recovery phase. Of course, people are often constrained on this because they may have no power, no phone lines and no internet, and that can go on for days or weeks after a natural disaster's come through. As far as you can though, keep your family and friends as informed as you can about what's going on, what's happened to you, what you need and what you don't need. Family and friends can be really, really helpful, from simple things like bringing around a meal. Sometimes they can really help with aspects of the cleanup that, for whatever reason, if you can't face it or there's some issues, sometimes your family or friends can actually get into some jobs that have become too difficult for you to do. You might have family who say, if you've got school-age kids or whatever, bring them over, we'll have them for the next week or so while you can get on with your work. So there's lots of different ways that family and friends can help. Certainly need to keep your staff as informed as you possibly can about, what the impact to the farm business has been, what the cleanup process is going to be like, what your sort of recovery plans are, what sort of timeframes you think you're going to be working with. If they're keen to help, by all means get them involved, so long as you're dealing with workplace health and safety issues, and we'll talk about that in a minute. As I mentioned before, social media and websites, if you can access them, can be really, really great ways to keep in touch with the rest of the world. As the days and weeks go by, you'll get a much more accurate picture of the damage you've experienced, the losses that you've got, and the impacts that you've had. That's not always going to be negative too, because as you go along, what looked like it was complete destruction, you may realise that, there's some areas of the crop that could be saved, there's damage that could be repaired, there's things that could be salvaged. So that's kind of a bit of a moving feast for a little while. So you need to, keep in mind that damage assessment, that impact assessment will continue to be revised and updated as time goes by. We do encourage growers to talk with GrowComm about what their impacts have been. We play a really important role in terms of helping the industry access natural disaster relief and recovery assistance that might be made available through government. The better the quality data and information that we can bring to develop those cases for assistance, the better off we all are. So as you start to prepare your sort of loss and damage impact assessment, and as you refine that over time, you just find there's actually a lot of uses for it. As I say, you might want to share that information with industry. There may be journalists from radio, newspaper, TV who are keen to interview people in the region, so that sort of helps you get your head together around what key messages you want to target through the media. It's obviously going to be useful for you in terms of preparing your insurance claims, developing your recovery plans. It might be useful too when you need to sit down with your bank to sort of think through some of your financial issues, and certainly can be very helpful if you decide to make an application for government assistance if that's made available. One of the lessons that we've learned from past experience from previous disasters is that you do need to be careful, because that impact assessment is a bit of a moving feast for a little while, to just avoid signing off on your insurance claim too early. Some growers have been caught out by signing that off too early, and then there's other things that they realise should have been included later down the track. So moving on to some of those issues around insurance, it's a really good idea to contact your insurers as soon as you can after the events happened, to start to get that process underway of lodging your claim and arranging assessments and getting that whole beast moving. As I mentioned before, you'll need to take plenty of photographs of the damage and the impacts. As we've talked about a minute ago, just be really careful about how you prepare your insurance claim, what you claim for, and to not sign off on that too early. Obviously, people in the industry would have, obviously we have a lot of people in our industry in past disasters who've come up with a whole lot of questions, or in some cases some real problems and disputes with their insurers. So there's information on the GrowComm website about how to get in touch with the Insurance Council of Australia. There's also a financial ombudsman, so if you need to elevate a dispute that you're having with your insurer to a higher level, that's the place to go. If you don't have disaster cover, or the cover that you have doesn't cover you for what the disaster impacts that you've had, have a think about whether there's other options, if you've got, say, income protection insurance or some other option that you could go to. Another really important part of the recovery process is to kind of capture the lessons that you've learned from the experience. Industry recovery officers have suggested that this isn't something that you rush into. So once your power's back connected again, your phones are connected, you've got your insurance claim underway, some of the cleanups happened, you're in progress with your cleanup. That's the time to organise a sort of a bit of a formal get-together with your family, with your team, to just reflect on that disaster event and how you responded to it. So the sort of questions you might want to run through is, how well prepared were we? How did our emergency response procedures work? What have we learnt? What have each of us learnt? And are there things that would be good to do differently next time? So it's really good to kind of just capture that experience and incorporate those lessons into your future plans and your future procedures. If you've gone through a major disaster and there's a lot of damage, it's probably going to be really useful for you to actually formalise your thinking into a recovery plan. As you identify the tasks, the cleanup, the recovery work that needs to be done, start to write that down as you identify it, and then really spend some time thinking through how to organise, schedule and prioritise those works. A lot of people do get to the point where they're quite overwhelmed, and starting to get a recovery plan down on paper is a really valuable thing to do. Industry recovery officers have talked about the value of recovery plans, and they've said, people who are starting to feel helpless or starting to feel overwhelmed, it really does help in those situations. It puts you back in control of the workload. And the other really nice thing about it is that you can start ticking things off as they get done. So you're tracking your achievements, you're seeing the progress as it happens. There might still be a huge amount of work still in front of you, but you can start to see at least where you've come from and what you've achieved to now. So that's where your recovery plan can be really, really helpful. Some issues around financial management during a disaster recovery process. Early on in the piece, it's a really good idea to sort of do a snapshot, check in, assess your finances. Have a look at what cash you've got available. Perhaps look at developing a cash flow forecast if that seems like a good idea. Really try to make an assessment of the position of your business in terms of its, for example, using a profit and loss report. This might be a time when you might need to get some advice and assistance from your accountant or whoever you normally use to help you with your finances. You really need to be very careful to manage your finances carefully during the recovery phase, This is where your accounting, your monitoring and your financial reporting tools really come to the fore, and they're really important. This might be a time when you need to look at refinancing. You might need to talk to your bank about adjusting or delaying your loan repayments. And something that a lot of growers have found, and it might sound surprising, is that the good old Australian Tax Office, the ATO, might be your friend during the disaster recovery time. There's a whole range of things that they might be able to help you with in terms of fast-tracking a tax refund, deferring payments, delaying a repayment of debt. They might be able to relax the lodgement periods for paperworks or documents that you need to put in, and they often can give you some advice on assistance that might be available to disaster-affected people and businesses. So let's just talk about how to manage staff during your disaster recovery time. We've touched on some of these issues already. Keep your staff well informed about the impact of the disaster, what the clean-up and recovery process is and the time frames. Some staff are going to be unable or perhaps unwilling to come back to work for you after the disaster. Some people will have left the region. Some people might not be able to access your property. Some people might have impacts of their own that they're struggling to deal with. So there can be a whole lot of changes and things going on around staff following a disaster event. On the other hand, you may have staff who are quite willing and able to get to the property. They may be quite willing to do some volunteer clean-up work. They might be really keen and sympathetic and wanting to help you get back on your feet. You do need to be really extra careful of health and safety issues, obviously, after a disaster event if there's a whole lot of crazy stuff going on around the property. Do keep an eye on your staff if they've been through the sort of trauma of the severe weather event or the disaster event as well. You may see signs that they might need some assistance with counselling or some sort of support. So, it's good to put them in touch with the services that might be out there. Some growers have actually discovered that during the disaster recovery phase, they've discovered qualities and skills in staff that they didn't know they had, or some leadership abilities that they've had. So that's actually sometimes a really nice sort of side effect of the disaster experience and the recovery process. Sometimes government makes wage assistance available as part of their support and recovery package to industry. That can be really valuable if that's available. If you can't retain staff, have a look at what your options are. Perhaps they have some accrued leave that they could use. If you need to check with the Fair Work Ombudsman or the Fair Work website, you might be able to find out what options you might have to stand down staff sort of temporarily, perhaps without pay. It's just good to check in what all those industrial relations options might be. There's often a lot of assistance around in regions that have been affected by natural disasters. Be prepared to tap into that if you need it. Regional councils play an amazing and important role following disasters, coordinating what goes on in terms of the local recovery effort. They are often quite keen to have horticultural industry people involved with their various recovery committees, so do keep that in mind, whether that's something that you'd be interested to do or to help, or perhaps you might like to identify someone in your local industry who'd be good to play that role. It's quite useful for our industry to be better connected to regional councils. As I mentioned, there's often state and federal government assistance if the disaster's been a severe one. There can be assistance packages. They'll be announced through the media. We'll also put that information on our websites. There's quite often industry recovery officers that are put in place. They're often based in industry organisations like GrowComm, and they play a really important and helpful role for our industry. Where there's immediate assistance measures, you often access them through the Centrelink office, and a lot of growers obviously would feel that's not the usual place where they would go, but you just need to keep in mind that that's sort of the government's shop front, and that's the place to go if you want to access some of those immediate and short-term assistance measures. During the recovery phase, you certainly want to stay as connected as you can be. There's a lot of organisations who've developed a really good track record of providing valuable and useful help to industry and to farm businesses following a disaster event. As I mentioned, the regional councils often have these recovery committees for various aspects of the local recovery effort. GrowComm is quite experienced now in supporting our industry in disaster recovery. There's other industry organisations who are also experienced now and can really be very helpful. The Red Cross is often a really valuable organisation for a lot of people. And don't forget things like the Small Business Advisory Service. They can often provide specialist assistance for disaster affected people. Regional natural resource management groups often have a lot of useful projects that they roll out following a disaster event. And there's organisations like GiveIt, which is like a web-based service where you can log the things that you need and they'll help connect you with people who've got those things to donate. So that's they've actually got an official role as in disaster recovery now. So that website's available through links on our website. Natural disasters can obviously be a very traumatic experience. It's actually quite common for people who are recovering from a natural disaster event to experience some mental health problems around stress, around anxiety and depression. The main thing is to just sort of stay tuned in and keep yourself aware of how you're feeling. Keep talking with your partner, with your friends, with your family, and keep an eye on your partner and your friends and your family members and your staff. These are the times when it's really important to make use of online information and resources that are out there, or other, like you're in a Red Cross and other counselling services that might be operating in the region following a disaster event. One of the things that industry recovery officers have said to me is that they've worked with growers who, when the clean-up and the recovery process becomes a bit overwhelming, it really is a good idea to take a break. You might feel like you can't, that the amount of work that there is to do means that you just have to keep on doggedly at it. It's actually a really good idea to if you can, to take a break right out of the region so that you get out to an area that's not affected by the disaster. Catch up with friends who haven't been affected by the disaster. Get away and do something that you normally enjoy doing. It's amazing how, whether it's for a few hours or a couple of days, how just taking that break can help you come back a bit refreshed and sort of give you a bit of fresh energy to get going again. People who sort of feel that they're having some real impacts on mental health as a result of the disaster event will usually cope fairly well if they've got support from family and friends. Some people also find it useful to talk with a counsellor, someone who's a trained person you can sort of talk with about what's going on in your head, and who can make some suggestions for how you might be able to cope, some strategies that you might be able to use to get back to good health, to get back to a good headspace. People have talked about that's a very personal decision about whether you go to a counsellor who knows you or who knows the area, or to find someone who doesn't know you and doesn't know the local community. That's just a personal choice that you'd probably want to make. If you're finding though that the impacts on your mental health are more severe, or they're not getting better over time, or perhaps getting worse, if you're picking up warning signs around having a lot of trouble sleeping, having feelings of panic, being very sensitive to memories about the event, you're crying a lot, you've had a loss of appetite, if you're just unable to concentrate or make good decisions, that might be a warning sign that things aren't going well for you or for someone who you care about. And that's the time when you need to sort of make a call about whether some specialist care or some sort of treatment might be needed. And the first step about doing that is usually just to go to your GP, explain how things are, and they've got some really good assessment tools now for sort of making some preliminary diagnosis and getting people in touch with the support that they might need. There is quite a lot of mental health information and services around. Often things are mobilised, often sort of on the ground services are mobilised in regions. There's some really useful phone counselling lines, obviously through Lifeline. There's a really valuable thing that's it's called the Suicide Callback Service. That's useful for people for a range of purposes, right? So if you've got suicidal thoughts, that's a person to contact. If you're worried about someone you care about and you're worried that they're in a suicidal position, and also for health professionals. So that's actually a really valuable service that's available. There's a whole range of online resources and websites. So there's Lifeline, there's Beyond Blue, there's Mind Health Connect. There's another one called Sane. For younger people, things that are more geared towards younger people, you can Google Headspace or reach out. So there's a whole range of things out there, and they've actually got some really useful resources for people to help you get back into good mental health. So I hope you found that useful. If you're looking for more information, just jump onto the GrowCom website. There's a whole lot of resources and information available on there, links to other websites. You might also like to check out the Queensland Farmers Federation website. They've got some really useful videos as well around disaster resilience and recovery. I hope you've got some useful information from this series of disaster preparation websites, and we'd just like to thank again the support we've had from the federal government to support this really important industry initiative.